Colorado Territory, 1875. Settlers Creek train station stood alone against the encroaching wilderness, its weathered platform the last outpost before the untamed frontier stretched beyond. The late autumn wind carried the bite of coming winter, howling through the gaps in the wooden boards as if warning travelers to turn back while they still could. Thomas Dunfield pulled his collar higher against the chill, his storm-gray eyes scanning the horizon where dark clouds gathered. At 25, he'd already seen more of life's cruelty than most men twice his age. The war had taken his father, the frontier had claimed his mother, and the unforgiving land had taught him one truth he held above all others. A man alone survives, but a man with attachments only collects more graves to dig. His lean frame carried the strength built from years of breaking horses and driving cattle, but without the weathered harshness that marked older cowboys. His face remained youthful despite the light stubble that had grown during his 3-day ride, and his movements held the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than on solid ground. "Last train for 3 weeks, Mr. Dunfield," called the station master, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming faster than expected. You sure you don't want to wait it out in town?" Thomas shook his head. "Got 200 head of cattle need tending. Been gone too long already." He patted the supplies strapped to his paint horse. 3 weeks' worth of provisions would see him through until spring, alone at his small ranch in the foothills, just as he preferred it. Attachments meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death in this unforgiving country. The station whistle blew, piercing the afternoon silence with its mournful cry. Thomas checked his pocket watch. The train was running late, but that wasn't his concern. He mounted his horse, ready to begin the half-day's ride to his isolated homestead before nightfall. That's when he saw her. She stood on the far end of the platform, a single trunk at her feet, her eyes scanning the empty landscape with growing desperation. Her pale blue dress, though quality fabric, was wrinkled from long travel, and her blonde hair, falling in loose waves to her shoulders, caught the dying sunlight like spun gold. She couldn't have been more than 22, and everything about her, from her delicate gloves to her polished boots, marked her as Eastern, completely unprepared for what lay ahead. Thomas turned his horse away. Not his problem. The West claimed the unprepared every day. It was the natural order of things. "Excuse me." Her voice carried across the platform. "Please, sir. Has the stagecoach to Silverton already departed?" Thomas hesitated, then reluctantly turned back. The station master had disappeared inside, leaving just the two of them as the train whistled once more and began pulling away. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Silverton stage left yesterday. Won't be another for 3 weeks now, especially with that storm coming." The color drained from her face as she looked toward the mountains where dark clouds gathered. 3 weeks. But that cannot be. I was assured there would be a connection. Thomas sighed. He'd seen it before. Easterners who believed the West operated on the same predictable schedule as their cities. Territory ain't civilized like back east. Winter's coming early this year. A drop of rain hit the platform between them. Then another. "Is there an inn? Somewhere I might stay?" Her voice held determination despite the fear in her eyes. "Nothing here but the station master's office. Nearest town's Copper Ridge, 15 miles back the way you came." The woman's shoulders slumped momentarily before she straightened her spine with visible effort. "Then I shall walk to Copper Ridge." Thomas almost laughed. 15 miles through mountain country, in those shoes, with a storm coming? You wouldn't make 5 before nightfall. He glanced at her trunk. "And you can't carry that." Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. The station master emerged from his office long enough to call out. "Closing up now, miss. Storm's coming fast. You best find shelter before disappearing again." Thomas watched indecision war across her face. Something about her determination stirred something he'd thought long buried. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he found himself asking, "What business you have in Silverton anyway?" "My uncle," she replied, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "He fell ill. I'm all the family he has left." Thomas shifted in his saddle, cursing himself even as the words left his mouth. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Taylor," she replied, offering a small curtsy despite their circumstances. "Of Boston, Massachusetts." "Thomas Dunfield." He gestured to the gathering storm. "Look, Miss Taylor, I've got a small ranch about 4 hours' ride from here. You can wait out the storm there, and I'll bring you to Copper Ridge once it passes." Suspicion immediately replaced the relief in her eyes. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly. Ma'am, your choices are my ranch or trying to sleep in that station with no fire and no food." Thunder cracked louder, closer. "I've got a proper cabin with a spare room. You'll be safe." Eleanor hesitated, weighing her limited options as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. "Sometimes angels get lost too," Thomas found himself saying, the words surprising him as much as her. "Even out here." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded once, decisively. "Very well, Mr. Dunfield. I accept your assistance." Thomas dismounted and secured her trunk to his packhorse, then helped Eleanor onto his paint. The rain began falling in earnest as they set off, the station disappearing behind them as they rode into the gathering storm. "Hold tight," he instructed as they navigated the increasingly treacherous trail. Eleanor's arms wrapped hesitantly around his waist, her touch as light as if she feared burning herself. An hour into their journey, the skies opened completely. Eleanor's dress was soaked through, her teeth chattering against his back. Without a word, Thomas removed his oilskin duster and awkwardly helped her into it while keeping the horse steady. "But you'll be soaked," she protested. "I'm used to it," he replied simply. They rode in silence after that, the storm growing fiercer by the minute. What should have been a 4-hour journey stretched longer as Thomas was forced to navigate flooded creek beds and muddy trails that threatened to swallow a horse's leg with one misstep. Night had fallen completely when they finally crested the last ridge. Below, a small cabin stood dark against the landscape, a barn and corral just visible through the curtain of rain. "There it is," Thomas called over his shoulder. "Dunfield Ranch. Not much, but it's dry." Eleanor's only response was a weak nod against his back. Her arms had tightened around his waist hours ago, no longer concerned with propriety. Thomas worked quickly once they arrived, stabling and feeding the horses before hurrying Eleanor into the cabin. He lit the lanterns and stoked the banked coals in the fireplace until flames leapt to life. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, rummaging through a trunk until he found a clean shirt and pair of trousers. "These will be too big, but they're dry. The bedroom's through there. I'll make some coffee." Eleanor took the offered clothes with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Dunfield." "Thomas," he corrected automatically. "Out here, formality doesn't keep you warm." When Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, Thomas almost didn't recognize her. His clothes engulfed her slender frame, the shirt sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands. She'd loosened her hair to dry, and it fell around her shoulders in damp waves. Without the trappings of Eastern propriety, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and Thomas felt an unwelcome tightening in his chest. He handed her a steaming mug. "It's strong. Sugar's on the table if you need it." Eleanor wrapped her fingers around the cup gratefully. "This is very kind of you." "It's what anyone would do," he deflected. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows as they sat in awkward silence. Thomas wasn't used to company, especially not female company, and certainly not a Boston lady who looked like she belonged in a painting rather than his rough cabin. "Have you lived here long?" Eleanor finally asked. 3 years. Built it myself. Alone." Thomas nodded. "That's how I prefer it." "No one prefers to be alone," Eleanor said softly. "I do." Thomas's voice left no room for argument. "People complicate things. Out here, complications get you killed." Eleanor studied him over the rim of her cup. "Is that why you said what you did at the station? About angels getting lost?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Just words." "They were kind words," she insisted. "From a kind man." "You don't know me, Miss Taylor." "Eleanor," she corrected with the ghost of a smile. Despite himself, Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch in response. "You should rest. Storm might last days. Bedroom's yours. I couldn't take your bed." "You're not." "It was my mother's." Thomas saw the question in her eyes and added, "She passed last winter. Fever." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, and he could tell she meant it. "My parents are gone too. That's why I'm going to my uncle. We're all that's left of our family." Thomas nodded once, acknowledging her loss without dwelling on it. "Get some rest." The next morning, Thomas woke on his bedroll by the fire to find Eleanor already up, attempting to work his temperamental stove. The sight of her in his clothes, hair loosely braided over one shoulder, moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there, sent an uncomfortable jolt through him. "You'll flood it if you open that damper too wide," he said, rising. Eleanor jumped slightly. "I wanted to make breakfast. To repay your hospitality." "You don't need to." "Please," she interrupted. "I'm not helpless, despite yesterday's evidence to the contrary." Something in her tone, determination mixed with wounded pride, made Thomas relent. "Damper halfway, then add kindling slowly." To his surprise, Eleanor proved a quick study. By the time he returned from checking the horses, she had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven. "Where did you find flour?" he asked, impressed despite himself. "In that disaster you call a pantry," she replied, a hint of teasing in her voice. "I also organized your stores. I hope you don't mind." Thomas should have minded. This was his space, his carefully constructed isolation. Instead, he found himself saying, "Looks better than when I left it." The storm continued unabated for 3 days. Against Thomas's every intention, a routine developed. Eleanor cooked while Thomas tended the livestock. She mended his clothes while he repaired leaks in the roof. In the evenings, they talked, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease. He learned she was 22, educated at a ladies' seminary, and had never married despite several suitors. "None of them saw me," she explained. "They saw a convenient match, a decorative wife, but not me." Thomas found himself telling her about the war, about coming west to escape the memories, about building his small ranch from nothing. "After so much death, I wanted to create something," he admitted. "Something that was mine alone." "Yet you raise cattle," Eleanor observed. "A living thing that depends on you." Thomas had never considered this contradiction. Animals are different. They don't expect anything except food and shelter. "And what do people expect that's so terrible?" Eleanor asked gently. "Parts of yourself you can't afford to give," Thomas answered, more honestly than he'd intended. "Out here, letting someone matter to you is just setting yourself up for loss." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds terribly lonely." "Lonely is safe," Thomas replied. "Safe keeps you alive." "Is merely staying alive enough?" she asked, her blue eyes searching his face. Thomas had no answer. On the 4th morning, Thomas woke to silence. The constant drumming of rain had stopped. He stepped outside to find the world transformed, mud and debris everywhere, but the sky a brilliant blue. The storm had passed. "We can leave for Copper Ridge today," he told Eleanor over breakfast. "You can catch the next stage to Silverton from there." Something like disappointment flickered across her face before she nodded. "Of course. Thank you." They rode into Copper Ridge that afternoon, Eleanor now dressed in her own clothes, dried and pressed as best she could manage. The town was a single muddy street lined with false front buildings, a far cry from Boston, but civilization compared to Thomas's isolated ranch. "The hotel's there," Thomas said, pointing. "Stage office next door." As he helped Eleanor down from his horse, their hands lingered together longer than necessary. Thomas cleared his throat and stepped back. "I'll see to your trunk." While Eleanor secured a room, Thomas inquired at the stage office, only to receive troubling news. "Bridge to Silverton's washed out," he told her when she rejoined him. "Won't be repaired for at least 2 weeks." Eleanor paled slightly. 2 weeks. "But my uncle." "I asked about that too," Thomas said. "Telegraph line's still up. You can send word you've been delayed." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." An awkward silence fell between them. Thomas shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of himself in a way he'd never experienced. "Well, I should head back. Would you join me for dinner?" Eleanor blurted out. "As thanks for your help." Every instinct told Thomas to refuse, to return to his safe isolation. Instead, he heard himself say, "I'd be honored." That evening in the hotel's small dining room, Thomas felt acutely out of place. He'd bathed and changed into his one decent shirt, but he was still a rough rancher amid the relative refinement of the hotel. Eleanor, however, smiled at him as if he were the most welcome sight in the world. "I sent a telegram to my uncle," she said. "His condition has improved slightly." "That's good news," Thomas replied, genuinely relieved for her. Their conversation flowed more easily than Thomas expected, perhaps because the barriers had already begun falling during their days in the cabin. When Eleanor spoke of her dreams, to someday open a school, to see the natural wonders of the West that she'd only read about. Thomas found himself hanging on every word. "And you?" she asked. "What dreams do you have beyond your ranch?" The question caught him off guard. Never thought much beyond the next season. Getting the herd through winter. Building up stock in spring. Surely there must be more you want from life. Eleanor pressed gently. Thomas stared into his coffee cup. Once maybe. Not anymore. What changed? He met her eyes. Everything. Later, as they stood outside her hotel room, Thomas found himself reluctant to say goodnight. "I'll check on the stage situation tomorrow," he offered. Eleanor nodded, then hesitated. "Thomas, She stopped, seeming to search for words. "What is it?" he asked softly. "Thank you," she finally said. "Not just for the rescue, but for seeing me." Before Thomas could respond, she quickly rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then disappeared into her room. Thomas stood frozen in the hallway, his cheek burning where her lips had touched. Something dangerous was awakening inside him, something he'd believed long dead. He returned to his ranch the next morning, telling himself it was to check on his livestock after the storm. But as he rode the familiar trail, Thomas couldn't escape the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest. His cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt emptier than ever. 3 days later, Thomas found himself back in Copper Ridge with the flimsy excuse of needing supplies. He told himself he wouldn't seek Eleanor out, that he was merely being practical by stocking up after the storm. Yet somehow his feet carried him to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, where he'd heard Eleanor had volunteered to help while waiting for the stage. Through the window, he saw her reading to a group of children, her face animated as she brought the story to life. The children watched her with rapt attention, hanging on her every word. Thomas stood transfixed, unable to look away. When the lesson ended and the children filed out, several of them noticed him and waved. Eleanor looked up, surprise and pleasure lighting her face when she saw him. "Thomas, what brings you to town?" "Supplies," he said, the lie tasting bitter. "How's the schoolteacher managing with an assistant?" "Mrs. Peterson is grateful for the help," Eleanor replied, gathering her books. Many of these children missed weeks of lessons during the storm. Thomas nodded, searching for something more to say. "Any word on the stage?" Eleanor's smile dimmed slightly. "Another week, at least. The bridge repairs are progressing slowly." "I see." Thomas shifted his weight. "If you need anything, would you show me?" Eleanor interrupted. "Show you what?" "The West. The real West." Her eyes shone with excitement. "I've been reading about the mountains, the forests. Everything is so close, yet I've seen nothing but the inside of buildings since I arrived." Thomas should have refused. Taking Eleanor into the wilderness, spending more time with her, would only make it harder when she inevitably left. Instead, he heard himself say, "Tomorrow. We'll need an early start." Eleanor's brilliant smile was worth the risk. The next day dawned clear and crisp. Thomas waited outside the hotel, his horses saddled and ready, uncertainty gnawing at him. When Eleanor appeared wearing a divided riding skirt and boots, her hair braided practically down her back, his breath caught. "Mrs. Peterson lent me the riding clothes," she explained, noticing his surprise. "She said they would be more suitable than my dresses." She was right, Thomas managed. He helped Eleanor mount, trying to ignore how naturally his hands fit around her waist. They rode into the foothills, Thomas pointing out landmarks and sharing the stories behind them. Eleanor listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her genuine interest in the land and its history. Near midday, they reached Thomas's favorite spot, a high meadow overlooking the valley, with mountains rising majestically beyond. "It's breathtaking," Eleanor whispered as they dismounted. No book could do this justice. Thomas spread a blanket on a sun-warmed rock and unpacked the lunch he'd brought. As they ate, Eleanor told him more about her life in Boston, about the suffocating expectations that had followed her since childhood. "My parents wanted me to marry well, to secure our family's position," she explained. "When they died, those expectations died with them. For the first time, I could choose my own path." "And that path led you west," Thomas observed. Eleanor nodded. "To my uncle, yes. But perhaps to something more as well. Something I couldn't find in Boston." "What's that?" She met his eyes steadily. "Freedom. The space to discover who I truly am, not who others expect me to be." Thomas understood that feeling all too well. The West is good for that. No one cares about your past out here. Only what you can do now. Is that why you came? Eleanor asked. To escape your past? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Partly. After the war, everything back east felt hollow. False. Out here, things are simpler. Hard, but honest. Yet you isolate yourself, Eleanor observed gently. Even from the honest hardship of connection. Her insight struck too close to the truth. Thomas stood abruptly. We should start back. Days get short this time of year. Eleanor didn't press, but as they rode back to town, Thomas felt the walls he'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. This woman saw too much, understood too well the fortress he'd built around his heart. Their rides became a daily occurrence. Each morning, Thomas would arrive at the hotel, and Eleanor would be waiting, eager to explore another corner of the territory. He showed her hidden waterfalls, ancient Indian petroglyphs, forests where elk moved like shadows between the trees. With each passing day, Thomas felt himself drawn deeper into her world, and her into his. A week later, as they rested beside a mountain stream, Eleanor suddenly asked, "Why did you really say that? At the station, about angels getting lost?" Thomas stared at the rushing water, remembering. My mother used to say it. When something unexpected happened, something good. She believed angels sometimes wandered off their path to help those who needed it most. Did you believe her? I did. Once. Thomas picked up a stone and tossed it into the stream. Then the war came. Then she died. Hard to believe in angels after that. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Perhaps that's why they get lost, she finally said. To find those who've stopped believing. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt something shift inside him. The afternoon light caught in her hair, turning it to gold, and her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. The stage leaves tomorrow, he said abruptly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Bridge is repaired. Eleanor's smile faltered. Yes, I received word this morning. The ride back to town was subdued. At the hotel, Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. I should thank you, she said softly, for showing me the true beauty of this country. Thomas nodded stiffly. Safe travels to Silverton. He turned to leave, but Eleanor caught his arm. Thomas, whatever she meant to say was interrupted by shouts from down the street. They turned to see men running toward the bank, where smoke billowed from broken windows. It's a robbery, someone yelled. The Washburn gang. Thomas instinctively pushed Eleanor behind him as 5 men burst from the bank, guns drawn, firing wildly as they mounted waiting horses. Get inside, Thomas ordered Eleanor, drawing his own revolver. Instead of obeying, Eleanor clutched his arm. Thomas, no? There are too many. One of the bandits spotted them and raised his gun. Thomas shoved Eleanor aside as the shot cracked past them. He returned fire, hitting the man in the shoulder. The outlaw tumbled from his horse, but managed to scramble back on as his companions provided covering fire. In the chaos, Thomas felt a searing pain across his side. He staggered, pressing his hand to the wound as the bandits galloped out of town. Thomas. Eleanor's face appeared above him, pale with fear. You're hurt. Just a graze, he grunted, though the spreading warmth beneath his fingers suggested otherwise. Are you hit? No, I'm fine. Eleanor helped him to his feet. We need to get you to the doctor. The town doctor confirmed Thomas's wound wasn't life-threatening. A deep furrow along his ribs that required stitches, but had missed anything vital. As the doctor worked, the sheriff questioned Thomas about what he'd seen. Washburn gang's been hitting towns all across the territory, the sheriff explained. Getting bolder every time. You're lucky to be alive. When the sheriff left, Eleanor took Thomas's hand. You could have been killed. Better me than you. Thomas replied without thinking. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. How can you say that? As if your life matters less. It does, Thomas insisted. You have people waiting for you. Plans. A future. And you don't. Eleanor demanded. Is that what you truly believe? Thomas couldn't answer. The truth was, until Eleanor had appeared at that rain-soaked station, he hadn't believed he had a future worth protecting. Just existence, day after day, alone with his cattle and his memories. You should rest, Eleanor said finally. Your stage leaves early. Thomas watched her go, words he couldn't form stuck in his throat. That night, alone in his hotel room, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's face as she stepped onto the stage, disappearing from his life forever. The thought was unbearable. The revelation hit him with stunning clarity. He loved her. In just 2 weeks, this woman from another world had breached every defense he'd built, awakening feelings he'd thought long dead. But what could he offer her? A hard life on an isolated ranch. Winters where they might be snowed in for months? It was selfish to even consider asking her to stay. Dawn found Thomas sitting on the hotel porch, watching as the stage was prepared for its journey. He hadn't intended to see Eleanor off. Better to make the break clean, but he couldn't stop himself from being there. When she emerged from the hotel, trunk in hand, their eyes met across the street. Eleanor paused, then walked directly to where he sat. "I thought you might not come," she said softly. "Wanted to make sure you got off safely," Thomas replied, rising to his feet despite the pain in his side. Eleanor studied his face. "Is that the only reason?" Thomas looked away. "What would you have me say, Eleanor? That I wish you wouldn't go? That these 2 weeks have meant more to me than the 3 years before them? Is that true?" Her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter," Thomas said roughly. "You have a life waiting for you. An uncle who needs you. I have nothing to offer except hard work and isolation." "You're wrong," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "You've shown me beauty I never knew existed. You've made me feel seen in a way no one ever has before." Thomas forced himself to meet her eyes. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When winter comes and we're trapped in that cabin for months? When you realize everything you've given up? You're so certain I would regret it," Eleanor said. "Have you considered I might find exactly what I've been searching for?" The stagecoach driver called out the final boarding. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder, then back to Thomas. "Ask me to stay," she whispered. "If that's what you want, just ask me." Thomas's heart pounded against his ribs. Everything in him screamed to reach for her, to beg her to stay. But the fear, the bone-deep certainty that loving someone meant eventually losing them, held him frozen. "I can't," he finally said. "I won't be the reason you throw your life away." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She reached into her pocket and pressed something into his hand, a small, folded paper. "Goodbye, Thomas Dunfield." Before he could respond, she turned and walked to the stage. Thomas stood motionless as she climbed aboard, as the driver cracked his whip, as the coach rolled out of town in a cloud of dust. Only when it had disappeared from view did Thomas open his hand. The paper contained an address in Silverton and 4 simple words: "If you change your mind." Thomas rode back to his ranch that afternoon, convinced he'd done the right thing. Eleanor deserved better than the life he could offer. She deserved cities and culture and comfort, not the harsh realities of frontier existence. Yet as days passed, his cabin felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. He found himself looking for signs of Eleanor everywhere. The organized pantry, the chair where she'd sat mending his shirts, the meadow where they'd shared lunch and secrets. 2 weeks after her departure, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Mills rode up to his cabin, his expression grim. "Dunfield," he greeted. "Got news you need to hear." Thomas invited him in, dread settling in his stomach. "Washburn gang hit the Silverton Bank 3 days ago," the sheriff said without preamble. "Took hostages when the robbery went wrong." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "Eleanor?" The sheriff nodded gravely. "Miss Taylor was visiting the bank when it happened. Her and 4 others. Washburn's holding them in an abandoned mining camp up in Bear Creek Canyon, demanding safe passage out of the territory. The Army won't get there in time," the sheriff finished. "Washburn's gave a 2-day deadline. That was yesterday." Thomas was already reaching for his gun belt. "How many men do you have?" "That's just it," the sheriff said. "I don't have men to spare. Every lawman in 3 counties is dealing with flooding from that storm. I came to you because you know that country better than anyone, and—" He hesitated. "And what?" "And the telegram operator said Miss Taylor asked for you specifically. If anything happened to her." Thomas felt something break open inside him, regret and determination flooding through in equal measure. "I'll need supplies. Ammunition." "Already brought what I could spare," the sheriff said, nodding toward his saddlebags. "I can give you the location, but that's all the help I can offer." Thomas nodded grimly. "It's enough." By nightfall, Thomas was deep in the mountains, following old hunting trails that would lead him to Bear Creek Canyon. The abandoned mining camp lay in a narrow valley, accessible by only one main trail, a trail the outlaws would certainly be watching. Thomas knew another way. Years earlier, he'd tracked a wounded elk through these mountains and discovered a steep, treacherous path that led down into the canyon from behind. No horse could manage it, but a determined man might. Under the cover of darkness, Thomas left his horse concealed in a stand of pines and began the dangerous descent. Each step threatened to send rocks tumbling down, alerting the outlaws to his presence. His wounded side throbbed with every movement, the stitches pulling against flesh not yet fully healed. Near dawn, Thomas reached a vantage point overlooking the camp. In the gray light, he could make out 3 cabins, a guard pacing outside the largest one. 5 horses were picketed nearby, one for each gang member. Through his field glasses, Thomas could see movement in 2 of the cabins. The hostages, he guessed, would be in the 3rd. He waited through the day, observing patterns, counting guards, planning his approach. As dusk fell, Thomas saw his opportunity. The outlaws gathered in the main cabin for dinner, leaving just one man guarding the hostages. Moving silently, Thomas crept down to the edge of the camp. The lone guard never heard him coming. A quick blow with the butt of Thomas's revolver sent him crumpling to the ground. Thomas dragged him behind the cabin, bound him with his own belt, and gagged him with a bandana. At the cabin door, Thomas paused, listening. Inside, he could hear soft voices, one of them unmistakably Eleanor's, offering comfort to someone who wept quietly. He eased the door open. 5 people huddled inside. 3 men, an elderly woman, and Eleanor. Her face, when she saw him, transformed from fear to disbelief to joy in an instant. "Thomas," she breathed. "No time," he whispered, moving quickly to her side. "We need to move while they're distracted." One of the male hostages, a bank teller by his clothes, shook his head frantically. "They'll kill us if we try to escape. They promised they would." "They'll kill you anyway," Thomas said bluntly. "Once they get what they want, you're just witnesses." The elderly woman began to sob. Eleanor knelt beside her, speaking softly. "Mrs. Harper, we must be brave now. This man has risked his life to save us." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for Eleanor's composure. "There's a path up the canyon wall," he explained quickly. "Steep, but manageable. We need to move now, while they're eating." One by one, Thomas led the hostages from the cabin and into the growing darkness. They moved slowly, painfully slowly, as the elderly Mrs. Harper struggled with the rough terrain. The bank teller kept glancing back fearfully, while the other 2 men, brothers who had been making a deposit when the robbery occurred, helped support Mrs. Harper between them. Eleanor stayed close to Thomas, her hand occasionally brushing his as if to reassure herself he was real. "How did you know?" she whispered as they picked their way through scrub brush. "Sheriff Mills came to the ranch," Thomas replied. "Said you'd asked for me." Even in the darkness, he could feel her gaze. "I didn't think you would come." "I'll always come for you," Thomas said simply. The truth of those words resonated through him like a bell. They had almost reached the cover of the trees when a shout rang out from the camp. The escape had been discovered. "Run," Thomas ordered, drawing his revolver. "Get to the trees." The hostages scrambled forward as lanterns flared to life in the camp below. Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets whining overhead. Eleanor refused to leave Thomas's side. "I won't go without you." "Eleanor, please." A bullet splintered bark inches from Thomas's head. He returned fire, forcing the outlaws to duck for cover. More shots rang out. Mrs. Harper cried out and stumbled, clutching her arm where a bullet had grazed her. The bank teller panicked, breaking away from the group and running blindly into the open. "No," Thomas shouted, but it was too late. A shot rang out, and the man fell. Thomas pushed Eleanor toward the brothers who were helping Mrs. Harper. "Get them to safety," he ordered. "The trail continues up, then bears east. Follow it until you reach a clearing with a lightning-struck pine. My horse is there. What are you going to do?" Eleanor demanded, even as the brothers urged her forward. Thomas checked his ammunition. "Buy you time." "Thomas, no." Eleanor clutched his arm. "You can't face them alone." Thomas cupped her face with his free hand. "I lost you once because I was a coward. I won't lose you again through inaction." He pressed a quick, fierce kiss to her lips. "Go, please." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but she nodded once and turned to follow the others. Thomas took up position behind a fallen log, firing methodically at the advancing outlaws. He needed to make each shot count. He had limited ammunition, and there were 4 of them. The first outlaw fell to Thomas's second shot, clutching his leg and screaming. The others became more cautious, spreading out to flank Thomas's position. A bullet tore through Thomas's shoulder, spinning him back against a tree trunk. Pain exploded through him, but he gritted his teeth and kept firing. Another outlaw went down, this one silent and still. 2 left. Thomas could hear them moving through the underbrush, trying to circle behind him. He was losing blood, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. He needed to end this quickly. Taking a desperate gamble, Thomas broke cover and charged toward the sound of movement to his right. He collided with one of the outlaws, sending them both crashing to the ground. They grappled in the darkness, each fighting for control of their weapons. The outlaw was younger, stronger, uninjured. He pinned Thomas down, pressing a knife to his throat. "Should have minded your own business, cowboy," he snarled. Thomas saw death in the man's eyes, accepted it, then blinked in confusion as the outlaw's expression went slack. The knife clattered away as the man collapsed sideways, revealing Eleanor standing behind him, a heavy branch in her trembling hands. "I told you," she gasped, dropping to her knees beside Thomas. "I won't go without you." Before Thomas could respond, the final outlaw emerged from the darkness, gun trained on Eleanor's back. Time slowed. Thomas reached for his fallen revolver, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. A shot cracked through the night. The outlaw staggered, a look of surprise on his face, then pitched forward. Behind him stood Sheriff Mills and 3 deputies, rifles still smoking. "Figured you could use some backup after all," the sheriff said, stepping forward to help Thomas to his feet. "Push the horses hard to get here." Thomas sagged against Eleanor, lightheaded from blood loss. "The others?" "Safe," she assured him. The deputies found them on the trail. As the lawmen secured the surviving outlaws, Thomas felt consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw was Eleanor's face above his, her tears falling onto his cheeks as she begged him to stay with her. Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and the sensation of someone holding his hand. He turned his head to find Eleanor asleep in a chair beside his bed, her fingers intertwined with his. Looking around, he recognized the doctor's back room in Copper Ridge. His shoulder and side were heavily bandaged, and the simple act of breathing sent pain shooting through his body. As if sensing his wakefulness, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then her face crumpled, and she pressed his hand to her cheek. "The doctor wasn't sure you would wake," she whispered. "You lost so much blood." Thomas's throat felt desert dry. "How long?" 3 days. Eleanor reached for a cup of water, helping him drink. "The sheriff brought us back to town. Mrs. Harper and the Harris brothers are recovering well. Mr. Finch, the bank teller, didn't survive." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the loss. "I'm sorry. You saved 4 lives," Eleanor said firmly. "Including mine." Thomas looked at her, truly looked at her. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair hastily pinned back, dark circles shadowed her eyes. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Why did you come back?" he asked hoarsely. "After I sent you away?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. "I never reached Silverton," she confessed. "I got as far as the first way station and realized I couldn't leave. I was on my way back to you when the stage stopped in Silverton for supplies. That's when the robbery happened." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "You were coming back?" "Yes." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because I realized something during our time together. All my life, I've been searching for a place where I truly belong. Not Boston, not my uncle's house in Silverton. It took getting lost at a train station to find it." "Find what?" Thomas barely dared to ask. "Home," Eleanor said simply. "You're my home, Thomas Dunfield. Whether that's in a cabin or a tent or under the open sky." Thomas reached up with his good arm, wincing at the pain, to touch her face. "I was a fool to let you go." "Yes," Eleanor agreed with the ghost of a smile. "You were. I love you," Thomas said, the words that had seemed impossible now flowing freely. "I think I loved you from the moment I saw you standing alone on that platform." Eleanor leaned down to press her lips gently against his. "And I love you. Enough to follow you into a gunfight, apparently." Thomas managed a weak laugh that turned into a groan as pain lanced through his shoulder. Eleanor immediately looked concerned, but he shook his head. "Worth it. The doctor kept Thomas in town for 2 more weeks, until his wounds had begun to heal properly. During that time, Eleanor never left his side. She read to him, helped change his bandages, and told him stories about her childhood in Boston. Sheriff Mills visited often, bringing news that the surviving Washburn gang members had been sentenced to hang. He also brought a letter that had arrived for Eleanor from her uncle in Silverton. He says his health has improved considerably, Eleanor told Thomas after reading it, and he understands why I couldn't continue my journey. Her cheeks colored slightly. I may have written to him about you. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What exactly did you tell him? That I found something unexpected at a train station. Eleanor smiled. Something worth changing all my plans for. When Thomas was finally well enough to travel, they rode together back to his ranch. The cabin stood just as he had left it, though slightly more weathered from the recent storms. It's not much, Thomas said as he helped Eleanor down from her horse. Not compared to what you're used to. Eleanor surveyed the small homestead, the sturdy log cabin, the corral where cattle grazed peacefully, the garden plot waiting for spring planting. It's perfect, she declared. Thomas took her hands in his. Eleanor Taylor, I'm not a man of many words, but I know now that a life alone isn't living at all. These past weeks have shown me what I was missing. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the twinge in his healing shoulder. Will you stay with me? Build a life here together? Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she pulled him back to his feet. Yes, she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes. They were married the following month in Copper Ridge's small church. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue, reminiscent of the one she'd worn when Thomas first saw her at the station. Sheriff Mills stood as Thomas's best man, while Mrs. Harper, fully recovered from her ordeal, attended Eleanor. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Thomas wrapped his arms around his wife. Are you happy? He asked softly. Truly. Eleanor leaned back against him, her hands covering his. Happier than I ever dreamed possible. Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. You know, my mother was right. About what? Angels do get lost sometimes, he murmured. One got lost at a train station and found her way to me. Eleanor turned in his arms, her eyes shining with love. Perhaps I wasn't lost at all, she said. Perhaps I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas knew she was right. After years of isolation, of believing that love was a weakness he couldn't afford, he had found his strength in Eleanor's arms. The frontier might be harsh and unforgiving, but faced together, with love as their foundation, they could build something that would last through any storm. Together, they had found their way home.